Dear all, highly esteemed audience here, welcome to the beautiful historical premises of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Academy, which many of you know very well, and also on behalf of the Professor de Vries Foundation, which may be a little bit less familiar to some of you. And this year's edition of our Professor de Vries annual lecture is a joint effort, or actually a joint pleasure. And we are very honored that Professor Joel Mokyr is our keynote speaker today. And a central idea in his work, in the work of this Nobel laureate, is that incentives matter. They matter for the supply of knowledge and ideas. And the Royal Academy, in one of its functions, is actually an institutional embodiment of one of those incentives, namely fame, local fame, and peer respect. Being elected as a member of the Academy is to be recognized by one's peers. It's a reward, not paid in money, but in reputation. And this is the currency that, according to Professor Mokyr's work, has driven much of the supply of new ideas. And of course, the Academy is also an institute where ideas are discussed and developed already for hundreds of years. The Professor de Vries Foundation plays a different, complementary role in this same market for knowledge and ideas. Professor Jan Tinbergen founded this stichting in 1954 in honor of his friend Frans, or François de Vries, the first chair of the Social Economic Council of the Netherlands. And later, he also invested his Nobelprijs in this foundation. So it was actually the opposite of patronage. He admired de Vries, especially for his contribution to bridging the gap between academia and socio-economic policy making. And the foundation's goal is, and has always been, exactly that: spreading and discussing top-notch socio-economic knowledge with those who value it. And I hope, dear audience, you are the ones that do so. In Mokyr language, the Academy rewards those who produce knowledge. The De Vries Foundation, well, to be maybe a bit modest as its president, you can see our work as the plumbing of the system. We lower the cost of access to knowledge and also help propositional knowledge flow to prescriptive knowledge, to practice, to policy, and to public understanding. Our annual De Vries lecture is our main plumbing instrument, and many Nobel laureates have given this lecture in the past. In this year's edition, we have a stellar set of speakers representing the supply side, and you, highly esteemed audience, represent the demand side. And without both, there is no market. The program is shown behind me after I have pushed a button. First, the keynote by Professor Joel Mokyr, whom I wish a very warm welcome here, and maybe an applause. The stellar set of speakers is completed by Maxime Februari and Professor Jutta Bolt, whom I also wish a warm welcome. I'm really happy you're all here. And following their reflections, we will move to a panel discussion and maybe almost immediately also leave ample time for a discussion with the audience, a conversation with you. I will be your Toastmaster today, together with Bas van Bavel. May I now invite you, Bas, to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker. And I wish you all a very inspirational and pleasant afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Mirjam, and well, welcome to you all. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, Professor Joel Mokyr. A short introduction, so not a full biography, but there's one thing I need to mention, being here in the Netherlands, and that is that you were born in the Netherlands, and in Leiden, and later on living in Utrecht before moving to Israel and later to the United States. And well, your Dutch roots make it even a greater pleasure to us to have you here as this year's speaker. In a way, the academic career of Professor Joel Mokyr also started with the Low Countries, with an investigation of the early process of industrialization, first half of the 19th century, comparing the Netherlands and Belgium. Belgium, early industrializer, and the Netherlands did not industrialize or only until much later, even though it was a highly developed and relatively rich economy. So a comparative analysis into the process of economic acceleration, innovation and economic acceleration. A comparison later extended by an in-depth study into the Irish experience, first half 19th century, leading up a very unsuccessful case, leading up to the tragic famine, mid-19th century famine, and also an investigation into a very successful case, Great Britain, the front runner in industrialization. So a search to factors, causes of economic acceleration. And I feel that in this search for these causes, you moved from conventional factors, including wage levels, energy supply, technology, and capital, access to capital, to what I think you argue are deeper causes, knowledge, useful knowledge, and the application, the adoption of that knowledge, or its non-adoption. And then even deeper causes, so a culture of innovation, a culture of growth, and exchange of ideas, a market for ideas, and also intellectual and cultural entrepreneurship. And then I think, and this illustrates your drive and your curiosity to dig even a layer deeper. In a very recent book, a co-authored book, Two Paths to Modernity, where I feel you dug even a layer deeper to the societal organization, allowing for this exchange of ideas and these forms of entrepreneurship by comparing a society where the formal and informal rules of the game, the institutions, and also the associated organizations allow for this exchange, open exchange of ideas in a context of trust, impersonal trust, as opposed to societies where this organization is more closed and maybe more top-down. And thinking about this, then one immediately recognizes that these are also the issues we think about today in our modern Western economies, about causes of stagnation and acceleration and innovation, and the obstacles in this process. So there's a clear relevance. At the same time, your work, I think, has always remained deeply rooted in history. So you do not use history as an illustration of your ideas or an illustration of economic theories, but as a source of knowledge in itself. And from there, inspiring the field of economics, building bridges between history and economics, I think very important to the benefit of both of these disciplines, and also inspiring a wider audience, as I hope also today. Maybe one last word about you as an academic colleague. Apart from all these prizes, including the Nobelprijs, and alongside all of the publications, I feel that you also take the service to the academic community very seriously. Also by forms of work that may remain unseen, including the editorship of the marvelous book series economic history of the Western world. And I know that you spend a lot of time and energy in pushing the authors forward again and again. And not only the senior colleagues, reputed colleagues, but also younger, talented people, in which you push by asking for even more revisions, better work. They may sometimes have cursed in the process, but I think we can all be very thankful for this work that is often unseen. You give young, talented people a platform. You encourage the exchange of ideas. So I think the market for ideas is not only something you study, but you also bring into practice. We are very much looking forward to your lecture, so I gladly give the floor to Professor Joel Mokyr.
Goedemiddag, dames en heren. Ik wilde me even verontschuldigen. Ik had in principe deze lezing wel in het Nederlands kunnen geven. En ik heb ooit een lezing gegeven hier in dit gebouw. Samen met Jan de Vries, mijn oude vriend van Berkeley. En ik dacht dat hij in het Engels zou doen. En hij dacht dat ik in het Engels zou doen. En we hebben allebei de lezing voorbereid in het Nederlands. En dat had ik in principe ook wel hier kunnen doen. Maar dat had me wel ongeveer 2 weken gekost om die slides in het Nederlands te vertalen. En ik heb er maar vanaf gezien. Dus ik verontschuldig me even dat dit allemaal in het Engels wordt. Maar ik wil toch wel even Bas bedanken voor zijn vriendelijke woorden en voor de KNAW en de Vries Stichting voor hun gastvrijheid. Now I switch to English. I'm sorry. So is the market, so let me first give you a little bit of the structure of the talk, okay? So I'm an economist by training and in many ways by disposition. And so this will be a story about markets. And of course, if you talk markets, as everybody knows, you talk about supply and you talk about demand, and I will talk about both, more about supply than about demand, but I will talk about both. But there's also something more than to markets than supply and demand, and that is what we call transactions cost. Okay? So, in principle, economists like to ignore that, but everybody knows better, and that going to a market involves costs. And sometimes these costs are so high that the market cannot exist. There are some markets that are like that, and some markets, and part of the process of economic progress might well be the decline in transactions costs, which made more markets possible. But that's a topic for another day. And finally, hopefully I don't run out of time, I will say something about the markets for ideas today as opposed to what it was like in the past. But, hang on, that's the wrong button. Yeah, here we go. So, is this really a useful concept? So I should say up front that I'm not the originator of the idea of the market for ideas. 2 other famous economists, Ronald Coase and George Stigler, both at the University of Chicago, by the way, and both Nobelprize winners, have written articles about the market for ideas, and I learned a lot from them. But my approach will be more historical, since I am an economic historian. But is it really a useful concept to talk about a marketplace for ideas? And in some ways, it isn't, because we associate markets with prices. And knowledge, or ideas if you want, is an odd product because it's very hard to think about a market clearing price in these markets for ideas. And even perhaps more serious for most economists, it's hard to talk about the concept of an equilibrium. Markets require equilibrium, right? That's what a market clearing price does. And it's not clear what we mean in a market for ideas in terms of an equilibrium. However, it is true that knowledge is valuable and it is scarce, and so it's a good. But it is not a regular good. In some ways, you could call it sort of the mother of all public goods. In fact, the market for knowledge and the market for ideas is maybe the most market failure prone of all markets. You know, everybody who's taken a first course in economics knows that markets are important, but they tend in many cases to fail, and so, you know, externalities and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there we have it. And so, but is it more so than the marriage market? You know, economists of family talk about the marriage market, and even in the marriage market too, it's sort of hard to think about a market clearing price, and there are other issues with the marriage market I'm not getting it into today, but the literature is out there. And again, for some reason, it is associated with the University of Chicago, particularly, of course, the work of Gary Becker, another Nobelprize winner. Now, markets, as Douglas North taught us, require institutions. That is to say, there have to be rules of the game that determine how people behave. It sets up the incentives and it sets up the behavior. That's true for all markets. It's a fortiori true for the market for ideas. But the rules for the market for ideas are quite different from other markets. And so the first question is, what's a transaction in the market for ideas? And so my notion of it, this is just sort of my idea, is that an agent, an economic agent, has a new idea, okay? It could be a really very important idea, such as, you know, the heliocentric view of our solar system, for instance. That's an important idea that changed the world. Somebody had the idea and wrote a book about it called the Revolutionibus, as everybody knows this. And of course, if you then convince somebody, then you've made a sale, right? Somebody changes his mind, or somebody accepts your idea and says, this is a good idea. And so you've made a sale. Now, of course, that sale doesn't involve any transfer of money, but if you convince somebody, that is, in the market of ideas, a sale. So if you write The Origins of Species, or you write Das Kapital, or whatever, as Wealth of Nation, you have an idea, you write it in a book, or you send a letter, or you talk to somebody, and that person says, yes, you're right, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. That sounds right. I'm buying it. So Adam Smith makes a sale. Now, in the 16th century, which is where I want to begin, how is this done? Well, of course, it is by that time the age of the printing press, and so much of it is done by writing books that other people read, or you can, an alternative to that, writing a book, you could nail 95 propositions to the church door in Wittenberg, as somebody once did, and, there was a very successful way of making a sale, many sales, right? And I would like to say, even so, of course, the communications technology has changed dramatically since Martin Luther nailed these propositions to the church in Wittenberg. It's basically not any different. You're writing a paper in economics, show some regressions, you prove a theorem, you write down a model, people read it and say, yeah, this is right. From now on, this is the way I'm going to think about it. That means you've made a sale in the market for ideas. Now, what I'd like to submit to you, of course, is that much of what we think of as modern economic growth is driven by changes in the market for ideas in Europe, beginning perhaps, or at least I'm going to begin, in about 1450 with the invention of the printing press and the beginning of the European voyages. And in that market for ideas, a subset of ideas is what I call ideas of useful knowledge. This is a term I've used in many of my writings, and it's basically very close to what we would call today science and technology. I like the term useful knowledge because that's how people in the 18th century called it, and also because there are things in it that aren't quite in the category of science and technology, things like geography, for instance, but these are debates about details. And as I said, this is a market that is prone to market failures. And so just a very brief introduction to useful knowledge as a public good. The first, of course, is that like all public goods, it's non-rivalrous, which means that if I have some knowledge and I give it to you, I don't have any less. That's sort of a standard definition of a public good in Econ 101, okay? It's also difficult to exclude people. It's not impossible, you can keep things secret, but if you told one person, only one person, you lost control, because that, you can't be sure that that person will not tell others, and so excludability has failed. And of course, if it's non-rivalrous, and there's no excludability, it becomes very difficult to reward people, to incentivize them to produce knowledge. Because why should I produce knowledge if I can, make a living of it, and nobody will pay me for it? I can convince people, but nobody will pay me for the knowledge, at least in most cases. Here is another reason why it's a market failure. If these two weren't bad enough, it gets actually worse, because useful knowledge, of course, has enormous externalities. That's to say, it affects other third parties, okay? But these externalities are both vertical, in the sense that knowledge builds on previous knowledge, or as Newton famously said, if I could see further, it's because I could stand on the shoulders of giants. That's essentially an example of vertical knowledge. So, Newton was working with there's the findings of Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe and so on. So there's, vertical knowledge, but there's also horizontal knowledge, in the sense that it affects knowledge, say, of certain techniques will affect other techniques that may hybridize with it in some way. And finally, of course, to make things even worse, is that the market for knowledge is riven with uncertainty, right? Somebody comes up with new knowledge, so how do we know this is true? And is it correct? Is it really new? And how can you tell the wheat from the chaff? When is information disinformation? How do you recognize charlatans and quacks and fakes, of which there were many in the 17th and 18th century? Trust me on this. To make things even more complicated, there are often barriers to entries, and there are many cases in history in which the market for knowledge was monopolized by some powerful entity. And yet, I will submit to you that one of the most important parts of a successful market for knowledge is actually free entry, or at least easy entry, so that people coming from the outside, homines novi, entering the market for ideas and say, hey, I got an idea and I want to spread it to the rest of the world. And, people like Martin Luther should count as that. He was an obscure professor somewhere in Wittenberg, and all of a sudden he becomes world famous. So, in many cases, historically speaking, we have cases in which the market for ideas was monopolized. Here are three examples. The medieval Latin Church, or the Catholic Church, but that's an anachronism, basically enforced a set of ideas by means of an institution, which is the church itself, and later, of course, some branches of it which were supposed to enforce the true knowledge, like the Inquisition and so on and so forth. Okay? A very different form of monopoly is the Chinese imperial examination, or it was known as the Keiju, which essentially meant that everybody who wanted to become somebody in China had to take a set of exams, and the set of exams meant everybody had to study the same curriculum of Neo-Confucian writings, and so basically that's what everybody studied. This was the monopoly. There was very little progress in any of the sciences or any of the philosophies outside the Neo-Confucian debates. There was some, but really very little. And finally, of course, you think of the Soviet Union, in which, particularly under Stalin, clearly the Communist Party imposed some kind of monopoly in the market for idea and made a commitment to what's known as Lyashenkoism, named after a Russian charlatan called Trofim Lyashenko, who was basically placed in charge of much of Russian science, much of which he couldn't understand. Moreover, the market for ideas characterized by resistance. And there's resistance in it because people have a fixed investment in their human capital. And then when somebody comes around and says, hey, I got a new idea that proves that everything you've studied over the last 7 years is wrong, that's not going to be invariably welcomed, okay? So Max Planck famously said that science advances one funeral at a time. And if you look at the history of science and medicine, there's a lot of sort of Max Pettenkofers. For those of you who don't remember who Max Pettenkofer was a fairly well-known German doctor who basically opposed the germ theory of disease that came around in the last quarter of the 19th century. And he saw a famous event. He drank a glass of cholera-contaminated water in his lab and showed that he wasn't going to get cholera. So Pasteur and Koch and all these other guys were wrong. That kind of resistance usually is overcome. But even Einstein himself, as many of you I'm surely know, ended up, even so his work led to quantum mechanics, he ended up rejecting the Copenhagen interpretation of it and its fundamental indeterminacy. And so even great scientists eventually become resistant to new ideas, and therefore new ideas have to work very hard to get established. It was even true for James Watt, the great inventor. I'm switching back and forth between science and technology, but Watt himself, a great innovator and a very open-minded guy, toward the end of his life, and many of these people were just toward the end of their lives, essentially resisted high-pressure steam engines and persecuted anybody who came up with it until the patent lapsed in 1800, and then things changed. So resistance is a fact of life in the market for ideas. And so, in the absence of appropriability, meaning nobody can own knowledge for the reasons I mentioned, how do we incentivize people to produce new ideas? And such incentives have to be somewhere, somehow, or else I would argue that what I call the UTHC, that's a term I'm using a lot, and what it really means is upper tail human capital. Basically means it's sort of the elite of inventors, of engineers, of scientists, mathematicians, and so on. So the very top people, maybe the top 2 or 3%. And so, as I said, in the late Middle Ages, maybe I would say, I would pick 1450, but that's disputable. The modern market for ideas start to emerge. And it was decentralized, and it was competitive. And those two things mattered a great deal. So what were the rules of this market? As I said, institutions set rules, and rules are necessary for markets to work. So first, it practiced open science. Okay, this is an idea that was promoted by historians of science like Mario Biagioli, or by economists like Paul David. Basically says, from now on, if you come up with a new idea, you put it in the public realm. You publish it. And much medieval science was actually kept secret by people who were university professors, and they said, well, if I publish this, then other people will teach my stuff, and I will have fewer students. And so they kept things secret. From 1500 on, okay, the idea of open science becomes very current in Europe. So if you come up with a new idea, you publish it. You write a book, or you write a letter to people who then disseminate the ideas to others. Okay. Secondly, it assigned priority rights to the person who first came up with the idea. So this is not property rights, because you don't own the ideas in the sense that you can exclude others, which is what ownership means, but at least you should want to be associated with that idea. And one of the interesting things that we see in this period, priority fights between scientists. So the most famous of these priority fights, which probably most people have heard of, is the famous fight between Leibniz and Newton about who invented calculus. But there were also minor priority fights, particularly between two Dutch scientists, Swammerdam and de Graaf, about the, I'm not making this up, ladies and gentlemen, about the genitals of insects, and who was the first to describe them in great care. And I think one of the two ended up committing suicide. I forget whether it was de Graaf or Swammerdam, but it was a nasty kind of thing. And then there was something else. which I'll come back to, which is, to my mind, very important. And that is in nullius verba. So that's Latin, and it really means on no one's word. And it was the slogan of the Royal Society established in 1660. And what it basically amounts to is an abandonment of what I call intellectual ancestor worship. That is to say, the belief that all the wisdom of in the world was revealed to our ancestors, okay? So most societies actually have some of that in them, okay? So in medieval Europe, the belief in general was that if you wanted to know anything about physics or biology, you looked it up in Aristotle. And my Jewish forefathers weren't so big on Aristotle, but they read it in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and of course the Holy Scriptures itself. And in Islam, it was, you know, the Quran and the Hadith. In China, it was the writings of Zhu Qi and the Neo-Confucian. I mean, every society has these sort of ancestors that they think they knew everything. If you want to know something, just study these old books and you'll learn. And this is abandoned. And it's an everlasting source of amusement to me how these various scientists, philosophers, and various writers slowly attacked every piece of knowledge that had been sacrosanct in Europe, okay? So there is some wonderful examples here. My favorite is a French philosopher called Petrus Ramus, or Pierre de la Ramée, who was eventually killed in St. Bartholomew's Night at 1572. But his dissertation was called On the Many Errors of Aristotle. You know, Aristotle had been like the gospel in the Middle Ages. Everybody taught and read Aristotle. Everything he did was wrong. And of course, Copernicus proved Ptolemy wrong, and Galileo proved Aristotle wrong in other things. And all these things slowly showing that the ancients had things wrong. And so, in nullius verba, nothing, you know, show me kind of thing. Don't take anybody's word for it. And of course, contestability means no sacred cows. So anything or anybody can be criticized. Even, ladies and gentlemen, the great Newton himself, who was kind of a little bit of a, you know, a semi-god to people in the 18th century, but even he was subject to criticism and people found mistakes in his work, more in the optics than in the principia, but still. Now, what this organization did was it assessed and evaluated ideas. So you would come up with an idea, you'd write a book or a letter to people, and then people would start corresponding and talking, probably less so because people lived spread all over Europe. But eventually you would get a reputation, and people had reputations. And reputations were valuable, as I'll argue in a minute. Finally, this organization, or this Respublica Literaria, the Republic of Letters, as they called themselves, was transnational and to a great extent trans-religious, which is, of course, a big deal in this period. And it was, and I say so, it's egalitarian and meritocratic. Of course, nothing in Europe is really egalitarian, but it was probably true that birth itself didn't matter all that much, and many of the great thinkers came from very low birth or even were outsiders. You think of somebody like Spinoza, who came an extremely influential man, who basically came from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, or René Descartes, who came from a sort of upper middle class family, but no aristocratic roots, and so on. Okay, so I don't want to say there are no barriers to entry, because if you didn't speak and write and read Latin, you weren't in this game. And so clearly that was a condition, but beyond that, reasonable. All right. And so all kinds of new ideas, of course, are proposed in the market for ideas. In religion, of course, we have the two giants, Luther and Calvin, but many others, of course, writing things in religion. And in philosophy, a whole range of people coming up with a variety of new ideas. These are all philosophers, but you can find the same thing, of course, in science. And so in the market for ideas of useful knowledge, there are some true rebels. Okay? Maybe the greatest rebel of all was Paracelsus, an early 16th century Swiss doctor who tried to overthrow single-handedly the entire medical opus that people had learned from the ancient Greek by the way of Arab writers, okay? But of course, Copernicus, Galileo, Stahl in chemistry, and on and on and on. And I think of these people in many ways as successful cultural entrepreneurs, a concept that Bassam Bava already mentioned, but I'm not going to get into that now. The most important idea that came around in this period, and that's the one I want to dwell on a little bit, is the idea of progress. And I would say that, but it's hard to know that there's books about the history of the idea of progress, I mean, going back quite a while. And I think it's probably a fair statement to say that even though it was not quite new in the 16th and 17th century, it at that time became slowly but certainly one of the most successful ideas in European history. So I suppose Francis Bacon plays a major role in it, as I've argued in a long and rather boring chapter in my 2016 book. But many others participated in here. So one of them was Blaise Pascal, who later on went a little bit gaga, but when he writes his 1647 book, he still is very much in a progressive kind of mood. And he had this famous passage in which he explains that humanity should be thought of really as a single person who lives forever and continually learns over time. And so I think it's a point that once you think about it, it's kind of obvious. But it's just humanity collectively accumulates knowledge. And so successive generations keep piling up, and hence science cannot but progress over time. And that idea, of course, directly challenges antiquity. So what occurs in Europe, and this is almost comical to read these days, I think, is they have this sort of famous, what the French call the querelle des anciens et des modernes, in which they have this silly debate about who's greater, the civilization of ancient Greece and Rome, or our own civilization. So is Aristophanes a better writer of plays than Molière or Racine, something like that? I mean, this looks sort of a little bit childish, but the importance of it is that by 1700, basically this debate is over, and the moderns have won. The classics are still taught. People still learn Latin and Greek, but their science and their biology, their physics, their geography, all of this, everybody understands that this is all completely wrong. So here's this one example of this thing. This is a man called Charles Perrault, and this is his book. You can see this argument. He's a great modernist. So Perrault is famous also for codifying a bunch of these sort of folk tales and legends. But essentially, what it says here is what I just said, which is this is the kind of debate that Europeans have in this this is second half of the 17th century, and by 1700, basically this is over. And so argument is humanity keeps advancing, and that becomes, I think, a foundation in which I think of the Enlightenment. Now, everybody that works in the Enlightenment defines it differently and thinks differently about it. Some think it's the greatest thing, that ever happened. Some think it's a disaster. And most of the people, like myself, find themselves in between. But everybody agrees that it is important. So let's find it. But in the 18th century, the idea of improvement becomes central to European thinking. And then the question is how to bring it about. So let me first talk about the supply side and then talk about the demand side. So as I said, to produce useful knowledge that will eventually help you creating better technology and making people richer, you need incentives. And what happens in Europe in this era is what I call the great bifurcation. And so to see what I mean by that, I have to come back to a distinction I made over 25 years ago between what I call prescriptive knowledge, which is essentially technology, it's a knowledge of how, and propositional knowledge, which is science. So it's description of the what in the world as opposed to the how of the world, so to speak. So prescriptive knowledge and propositional knowledge slowly bifurcated in the kind of incentives that they were facing. And so with prescriptive knowledge, it's relatively simple. When I say relatively simple, I don't mean it's simple, but it's comparatively simple. And the reason is that Europeans hit upon the idea of giving people temporary monopoly rights if they came out with a really useful invention, which is known as patents. So the first patents actually date significantly enough from Venice, from the middle of the 15th century. And then, of course, they were adopted in some places in Europe, particularly here in the Low Countries, but also in England in the Patent Law of 1624. In other countries, like the United States and France, they were introduced almost immediately after their respective revolutions. And that, I think, is significant because it really means that this is very deeply ingrained in Enlightenment thought. And at least the people who brought about the French Revolution, at least the earlier ones, and the people who brought about the American Revolution, both were deeply suffused with Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment. And so what a patent system actually says is that the market for ideas is relegated to the actual market for goods. So if a patent is subjected to a market test. If you produce a new idea, you take out the patent for it. If the people want to buy it, you'll make money. If they don't want to buy it, you fail the market test, you will not make money. Adam Smith makes this point very explicitly, not in The Wealth of Nations, but in his lectures of jurisprudence, which is harder to read, but which has a lot of wisdom in it. And yet, the odd thing is that when you look at the history, this sounds like a really good solution, but when you look at the history, actually, most of the important inventions of the Industrial Revolution, not all, but most, were never patented, or the patent failed for one reason or another. Now, what that actually means remains to be seen, but clearly people knew that there was a patent system, and if you look at the number of patents taken out in Britain in the 18th century, it sort of looks like this, it's a straight line, and this is 1750, when the Industrial Revolution started to begin, and all of a sudden you see the numbers of patents go like that. And so there's something there, but what it exactly is, takes a little bit more of analysis, and I'll postpone that to another time. But it's true that not just patents secured money for inventors. There were all kinds of other ways of making money. And I call these TERs, which are temporary exclusionary rents, which is sort of economies for saying making some money when you have a new idea until others come in, okay? So one of these, of course, is just keeping things secret. Some people tried that. Usually doesn't work very well. It depends a bit on what's known as reverse engineering. So some things can be easily reverse engineered, and some things cannot. The most famous invention, I think in history, of something that could not be reverse engineered and has been kept secret for over a century is Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola is the prescription is hidden in a vault in Atlanta with 24-hour armed guards guarding it. I've actually never been sure if that isn't a fake sort of a publicity stunt or not. But it's supposed to be secret, and that Pepsi could never quite imitate the taste of Coca-Cola. All right. So the other thing that economists talk about is first mover advantage, right? So if I'm the first to invent something, even if others will eventually copy my invention, it will take them a few years, and in those few years, maybe I will collect enough rents to pay for the invention, maybe or maybe not. Then what society did in the 18th century is that if somebody came up with a really important invention, even if it was not patented, Parliament or some other body would actually pay them some pension in recognition of what they did for society. The most famous of all of these was Edward Jenner's invention of the smallpox vaccination in 1796, and Parliament eventually voted to pay him £30,000 at the time, which was a huge amount of money. So there was some of that. There were also things much smaller but prestigious, like private organizations such as the Society of Arts that was founded in 1754, in many ways sort of a paradigmatic Enlightenment institution in which people sort of said, well, we need to encourage people to invent, so we'll give them prizes and we'll give them medals and we'll give them, you know, that kind of thing. And then there are, of course, a few cases of what are known as ex-ante prizes, okay? The most famous of all of these, I think, is the Board of Longitude Prize, established in 1714, in which basically the Board of Longitude promised a huge amount of money, I think it was £20,000, to the first person who could come up with a device to measure longitude at sea, which was a well-known problem that had been bedeviling ships for years and years and years. And in fact, somebody won it. John Harrison won it in the 1750s, and basically stimulated by this prize. Something similar, but not quite as good an outcome, was the prize promised by the Société d'Encouragement pour l'Industrie in France for somebody who could come up with a machine that could spin linen mechanically. Of course, machinery that could spin cotton had been invented in England in the 1760s, but linen is a different product, and it was hard to do. But because France was blocked by the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, they had very little access to cotton, but they had access to linen, which they flax grew in France. So this organization promised this prize. It was supposed to be paid by the emperor, and this man, Philippe de Girard, actually solved the problem. Unfortunately for him, by the time he solved it, Napoleon was in Russia and had probably other things on his mind, so he never got paid for it. But it is an example of trying to entice people to spend time and money and trying to invent things. Then there are reputation effects. Some people, engineers, basically didn't want to take out patents. They just want to be known as great engineers so that they would get commissions. And a few inventors got patronage jobs. But these are all ways in which people who invented things could make money. But what about people who came up with propositional knowledge? And here what we call in economics, the incentives are low-powered. There's no direct correspondence between the importance of a discovery and the payoff for the person who comes up with it. So if there's no easy way of monetizing it, why would anybody bother? And here I must say, again, the Western world came up with a set of brilliant ideas in order to do exactly that. So I'm going to talk through 5 ways in which they did this, okay? The first and most well-known is patronage. So in the 16th century, even a little bit before, many of the great scientists of the time did get patronage jobs. There are 2 kinds of patronage jobs. There's the patronage job that we still have all over the world today. We have called tenured professorships. They don't pay. You don't get rich, but you're comfortable, and you're comfortable for the rest of your life, which is exactly what they want. At that time, of course, patronage was also given out by rulers or by very rich aristocrats or merchants. Maybe the most famous patrons of all was Emperor Rudolf II of Habsburg, who was still in Prague before they went to Vienna, who had a whole collection of great scientists on his court, including, of course, Johannes Kepler, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people actually did that. The most famous cases of patronage is the case of Galileo Galilei, who was a lowly paid professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, and then one day he gets a letter from the Grand Duke of Florence, who offers him a job 5 times the pay, no teaching, no committee work. What professor would turn that down? So he moved to Florence, where he was sort of court philosopher for many years until he got himself into some kind of trouble. Newton himself, of course, after he published Principia, was offered the Master of the Mint, which is also a patronage job. He didn't know bupkis about coinage, although he learned quickly, I must say. He was a bright guy. But it was obviously a patronage job. Leibniz, of course, was the court philosopher at the King of Hanover, before they was the Duke of Brunswick. So these famous people all got themselves knight patronage job. And once you start digging deeper, there are less well-known and famous people who also got patronage jobs. So everybody wanted to produce knowledge in the hope of getting one day, getting a phone call from Duke so-and-so or someone say, would you like to be at my court at that salary? And of course, it's not just the money, it's also social standing. You get to dine with the Duke, da-da-da-da-da. So it was very desirable. Here's one particular case, which not everybody may know. This is René Descartes, who was, of course, at the time a famous philosopher. And he was invited by Queen Christina of Sweden, who was a bit of a dilettante, I would say, but she was interested in philosophy, and she did want to turn her court into this northern center of learning. And so she invited a whole bunch of famous Europeans to come there. Most of them didn't want to go to Stockholm, which at the time didn't look like Stockholm today, trust me. But he went, and he was flattered, and it was nice to be at the royal court, and high social status. Unfortunately, he wasn't used to the climate in Stockholm, and he caught pneumonia and died a year later, but that was unanticipated. But it's a case of patronage. Then, of course, there's fame. And so reputations are useful to get patronage job, but I would assume, and I hope this doesn't come as a shock to anybody here, but many academics actually have egos. And you want reputations so that your peers, particularly, think that you are valued, and that appears directly in your utility function. It gives you warm glow to be respected by your peers. One way of doing this, and American universities have been getting very good at this, more so I think than European ones, is name chairs in university. Not just that you are a professor, but you are the XYZ professor of this and that. A key figure who I think is probably to be credited by inventing this, although I'm not 100% sure about that, was Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of the first Tudor king, Henry VII, who established the Lady Margaret Professorship of Divinity at the University of Cambridge and a lectureship in divinity at Oxford. So these are lectureships in divinity. They're not going to be opening the world for more new knowledge, but then eventually other chairs like that are being established, including, of course, the famous Lucasian chair in mathematics at Cambridge, which was first a privately endowed chair, as many chairs are, and Isaac Newton was the second holder of that chair. Somewhat comparable, I would think, and this is also around this time, is the establishment of the Collège de France in 1530 by François Ier. I'm the guest of the Collège de France there, so I looked it up. And, it's basically just what you think it is. It is, membership in a prestigious institution would serve as an incentive for scholars and make them perhaps create more knowledge that help their realm, okay? And so it presents some kind of prestigious platform. I am a member of the Collège de France, or I'm a member of, the KNAW. Every country has something like that these days. And the main purpose, I think, is to incentivize people hoping to become members one day to create more knowledge. That, I think, is now, I think at the time, maybe people were less concerned about what we would think of sort of social welfare functions and more about the prestige of the king. For instance, Louis XIV established the Académie Royale in France and had Colbert bring a whole bunch of famous people, including, of course, the great Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens, who spent some, I think, rather unhappy years in Paris. But he came there basically because he was one of the best-known scientists in Europe at the time, and for Louis XIV, having that man at his court was a big deal. And what happens, of course, is that this system creates what we call academic superstars. Many years before the Nobel Prize, the world already had academic superstars. And Newton is a particularly good example. His biographers pointed out that when he published Principia, there were no more than 100 people in all of Europe who could possibly understand the rather abstruse mathematics. But when he died in 1727, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, and tens of thousands of people, none of whom had read his books, were passing by his body as the great scientist of the age. And so that, I think, has an effect, because you get a whole bunch of younger scientists who see what a semi-god Newton had become, and basically they were trying to mimic him and sort of be like Ike, so to speak. That, I think, is an important effect. And so the idea of superstars and the kind of glory that attaches to them has become quite common in Europe after that. And there's an economics of superstars. There's a famous paper by Sherman Rosen, published by now almost 50 years ago. But it's a brilliant paper. And basically, what he points out is why do we have superstars? And it's not just, of course, in science. It's in football, it's in opera, it's in painting, everything. There's the one person who is the sort of LeBron James of painting or of poetry or things like that. And so, now, what creates a superstar? Well, you need one thing, and that is a way to having a widespread, possibly global reputation, which of course the printing press helped do. In addition, you need the product of the individual to be convex in output, and the production costs have to be essentially orthogonal to the size of the market. So that's essentially these conditions, which are a bit technical, are satisfied in this world. And essentially what it means, I think the non-convexity means that one Galileo's contribution is more than twice the size of the contribution of two mediocre scientists. I think that's what the non-convexity means. But essentially, the printing press reduced the cost of spreading knowledge around, because it's not much more expensive to print 10,000 copies of a book than it is to produce 20. And so in that regard, books, of course, made a big impact. Now, I don't want to say that there were no superstars in the Middle Ages. Certainly, Thomas Aquinas should be regarded as some kind of an intellectual superstar, and maybe Peter Abelard was quite famous in his days, but it's nothing compared to the kind of fame that somebody like Galileo or Spinoza enjoyed in their lifetime. And so these early modern superstars were main drivers in the market for ideas, and they were, as I said, incentivized in large part by fame. Also, if somebody gave them money, they would be glad to take it. And so here's a whole list of them. And below the superstars, of which there are a few and everybody knows them, there is a list of stars who are not quite as good as Newton or Galileo, but they're not bad, and they still have a reputation at the time. But what matters, and this is something that people have overlooked, being a superstar essentially meant that you were immune, more or less, to reactionary forces that were fighting against heresy. Because if you were an intellectual superstar and your king or your duke or the Inquisition or somebody didn't like you because you were a heretic, all you had to do was essentially pack up and go somewhere else, because you had you had a continent-wide reputation. And so the career of Comenius, Jan Comenius, the great Czech, what do you call him, philosopher, social scientist, researcher of education. And Comenius was kind of a troublemaker who had all kinds of radical ideas, and he moved around, I counted it, 17 times. He spent time in Amsterdam, he spent time in London. He was, of course, from Moravia, he was in Sweden, he was everywhere. He was even offered, believe it or not, in 1636, the first presidency of Harvard, which he very wisely turned down. But, Comenius was in trouble. He would pack his suitcases and go. But it was true everywhere. Never forget that Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan in Paris, and John Locke wrote the essays on tolerations here in the Netherlands. These people could move because they had big reputations. And so, but more than that, I think, superstars are a remedy for the failures in the market for ideas. Because you can think of it, if you're engaging on a career of science, you're buying a lottery ticket, there's some probability that you will become a superstar. And most people actually tend to overestimate the probability of becoming a superstar. It is a well-known phenomenon. But what it really means, of course, that is because all these people have hopes that most of whom will be disappointed in, the system will underproduce less scholarship than it would otherwise. It will still underproduce, but much less, because all these people are trying to generate knowledge in the hope of winning something. So that's not so good for the many disappointed scholars who, with optimism and exaggerated belief in their ability, leads them to die frustrated. But for society, it's a very good thing, because all this not useful knowledge has positive spillovers. And so here are some quotes from Adam Smith, who points it out. I'm going to skip this because you can all read the theory of moral sentiments on yourself. But what that sort of underlines is how important it is for priority rights. So that everybody would say, well, this idea is mine, okay? And I want everybody to know that it's my idea. So here's an interesting illustration of that. The great scientist Robert Boyle clearly wasn't in science for the money, because he was actually the second richest, or the third richest, depending a bit on whom you believe, man in England. So, but he liked science, but he didn't just like science for its own reason. He also wanted to be associated with it. And at some point there is a letter from him to Henry Oldenburg, who was secretary of the Royal Society, to make sure that he listed everything that Boyle had discovered, to make sure that he could secure his credit rights in his research. And of course, the same is true for Newton and so on and so forth. And this is still true today. And so I'm keep pointing out that this very similar phenomena are true today. Here's one case in point which I've always found very amusing. In 2003, the Nobel Prize was awarded for the invention of MRI machinery. And it was MRI, as people knew, were invented by three people. Two academics, Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield, and one guy who had taken it, left academe, produced these machines, and made an incredible fortune making them. It's a guy called Ray Damadian. And then the Nobel Prize was announced, and the two academics got it, and Damadian did not. And he was so angry and so frustrated. I mean, the Nobel Prize would be like chump change for this guy. But they took a full-page ads in the New York Times, the Washington, I remember the Wall Street Journal, saying the Nobel Prize committee cheated me because I deserved the Nobel Prize too. Now, this is not good form, I would say, but it really tells you that people want this, not just because of the money, but because the fame and the reputation that goes with it. I always found this a very interesting story. Now, I talk briefly about intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation essentially says that people, in addition to seeking income and fame, maybe there's some kind of intrinsic motive. So an intrinsic motive, you think about somebody solving a crossword puzzle. Well, so it's there, it's challenging, it's interesting, it's fun to do, but nobody gets famous for for solving a crossword puzzle, and nobody pays you to do it. It's just to sort of satisfy things. I would think that is a component in all societies, but in Europe it has sort of an interesting history, because curiosity, ladies and gentlemen, which is the main form of intrinsic motivation, has an interesting history in Europe that isn't all that well known, although historians have written about it. For many centuries, curiosity was thought of as a sin. St. Augustine, in particular, said, look, curiosity about the forces of nature is a sin because you're encroaching into the territory of God. And people shouldn't do that. They should be humble, they should be modest, and leave to God running of the universe, and you stay out of it. Even Aquinas, somewhat less, I would say unambiguously, still bought into that. And now here are two writers in the period that I'm talking about. Here is Francis Bacon, Here's what he says. He warns his readers not to fall into the error of thinking that the inquisition of nature is in any way, partly, in any part interdicted or forbidden. And then he cites from the book of Proverbs that he says that it is the honor of God to conceal a thing and the honor of kings to investigate them. So that's in the Bible. And nobody knows what the book of Proverbs meant by that, but I know what Bacon's interpretation was. It Hobbes, one generation later, basically defined curiosity as the desire to know the causes of things, and noted, quote, such as in no living creature but man, so that man is distinguished not only by his reason, but also by this take away the care of knowing causes. It is a lust of the mind, by its perseverance of delight in the continual and indefatigable generation of knowledge, exceeds the short vehemence of any carnal pleasure. I don't know about that, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe this is an idiosyncratic effect of Thomas Hobbes, but in any case, there you have it. But yeah, I mean, the cause for puzzle argument is there, and we know of cases of people who just basically did it for fun, okay? A good case is this guy Henry Cavendish, an English chemist who in the 18th century discovered hydrogen. He published very reluctantly a few things, but basically much of his good work remained unpublished and discovered only many years after his death. He was very shy and he wouldn't advertise himself. So it must have been basically just out of pure curiosity. Then I want to say something briefly about religion. European religion has had a very mixed history with science, of course. And there's a lot of literature that basically says religion is the arch enemy of scientific progress because religion is conservative, and they cite the big debate after Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and so on. So there's a very good paper published by my friend Roland Benabou in the Quarterly Journal with co-authors in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in which he points this out, very complicated economic model, but it's basically based on that. But the truth is that, in fact, there are cases in which religion supported the acquisition of knowledge, okay? First, of course, as I said, in the Middle Ages, much of what we would think today as R&D, also that's a bit of an anachronism, was carried out, of course, by men of the church and monks, maybe because they were most of the people who were literate at the time were men of the church or monks. But it's also true that even after the Reformation, particularly, surprisingly enough, Catholics set up institutions that wrote and taught science. You think about Christopher Clavius, a Jesuit monk who basically designed what is mistakenly known as the Gregorian calendar. It's called Gregorian because the Pope who assigned him this job, or commissioned this, was Pope Gregory. But Pope Gregory would never have been able to do the mass that Clavius did. There's a man called Athanasius Kirchner. So Athanasius Kirchner, his biography by, what's her name at Stanford? I can't think of her name now. But the title tells you something. It says, Athanasius Kirchner, the last man who knew everything. But he was a major scientist, mathematician, the founder of modern Egyptology. I mean, a polymath by every definition. Many other people were men of the church. You think of Marin Malsam, you talk about Campanella. Copernicus himself, of course, was a deacon in the church. Pierre Gassendi. Many others were churchmen. And finally, of course, there's Robert Merton's famous thesis that says that Puritanism in England, which was a religious movement, actually promoted science. I'm not going to get into that. It's a well-known story. And yet, it's probably fair to say that by the time of the Industrial Revolution, in the second half of the 18th century, physics and metaphysics were increasingly separated, okay? And there's a famous, probably apocryphal anecdote about Pierre-Simon Laplace and Napoleon, in which Napoleon supposedly asked Laplace, so where is God in your mathematical system of the universe? And Laplace supposedly answered, I have had no need for that hypothesis, sire. Je n'avais eu pas besoin de cette hypothèse. You know, I mean, it's probably made up, you know, I got to tell you. Everybody that looks at it, I've heard the story, but we don't know where it comes from. Somebody invented it. But it is the kind of story that if he didn't say it, he should have. Because it does reflect the spirit of the time. By that time, the number of major scientists who are really deep into religion is yet very small. And finally, I should add, some scientists are driven by altruism, just basically trying to do well. So you think about, a great example is the search of Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, who each of which helped come up with the vaccine against polio. Something similar was the case during the Industrial Revolution, when Humphrey Davy, who was probably the most notable scientist in England in the first decades of the 19th century, invented what is known as the miner's friend, which was a lamp that you could take down with you to a coal mine that reduced the chances of explosion. So it was a major thing. So, long story, I'm going to skip most of it. And for most people, I would think it's not that they were driven by one motive, it's some combination of those five, of curiosity, fame, money, and so on. Okay? Now, on the demand side, what about the demand? And so, clearly, this is an age in which neophobia and conservatism are on the defense. In 1690, William Temple, who was a famous English writer and diplomat, and every Dutch person should know William Temple because he is the guy who arranged the marriage between William III of Orange and Mary Stuart, which had momentous historical implications. But he was also a very interesting writer, and he says, the humor of this age is to despise what has been done before and to admire only what is new. And, you know, and 60 years later, the great Dr. Johnson says, the world is running mad after innovation. All the business of the world is to be done in a new way, you know, and I know not whether we shall not in time come to be married in a new way. Ha ha, little did he know. And so, anyway, I'm going to skip some of this, but I want to mention this, and that is the importance in the market for ideas, as I have said before, is the rise of skepticism, okay? And people sort of lost belief in the wisdom and the authoritarian views of classical science. And so they demanded something else. And in that vacuum, I think, step a large number of scientists, you know, beginning with Copernicus and ending with Lavoisier and beyond. So, in short, then, the demand does not come just from only very rich and powerful people, but from a much larger, if still small, segment of population of intellectuals, physicians, engineers, and so on and so forth. But why? What exactly were they looking for? And the answer takes me back to the idea of the belief in progress. If you believe in progress, and you think, as people in the Enlightenment did, that progress can be achieved by the expansion and dissemination of useful knowledge, then you should insist on innovation. And so people sincerely believed that scientific knowledge and expert engineers would increase efficiency and prosperity. And so we have evidence for that because people like James Watt, for instance, when he's working on his steam engine, he writes to his scientist friends in Edinburgh and asks them for advice. We know that the great Potter, also contemporary of James Watt, Josiah Wedgwood, had all kinds of chemical problems, and he actually had a problem with some varnish, and I forget the exact details, and he wrote a letter to none else but the great Lavoisier. and said, how do I solve this? And we don't have Lavoisier's answer, so it either got lost or he never responded, who knows. But the fact is, people believed that science would help them. And one of the consequences is the rise of the industrial consultant. Now, I must tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I've studied this a little bit. And consultants in the 18th century are basically a little bit like industrial consultants today, which is 50% of what they tell you you already knew, and the other 50% is wrong. But people still pay for them. And here's one case. This is John Whitehurst, and he advised industrialists and landowners on technical engineering problems. And he consulted people on power and water power and mills and mining. And he was by training, he was actually an instrument and clockmaker, but he was self-trained in science. Here's another one, Davis Gilbert, mathematical skills, advice to everybody and their brother-in-law. I mean, it's just 2 out of a large population. Now, having talked about supply and demand, I want to say a few things about the structure of the market. So, as I said, the markets depend on supply and demand, but there are also transactions cost. And they are basically there because purchases or transactions require resources to be consummated, It's still true today, also we've been very good at cutting these transaction costs to something close to zero, but you still have to, if you want a pair of shoes, you have to go to the shoe store and stand in line, and they don't have your size, and there's transactions cost in terms of time and often money. In the market for ideas, the equivalent of transaction cost are what we call access costs. It's an idea that I introduced many years ago, and I still think it's probably a good description. So what determines access cost? Well, basically the idea is that you are somebody who needs a piece of knowledge, and you're vaguely aware that somebody has that. But how do you get it? So it depends on things like storage costs. Storage costs are very low, like, you go into Google and, you click it, and Google stores all this knowledge, and the cost for it is very small, and the access costs are practically zero. But you need to know whether, in earlier times, you need to know where the knowledge is. Was it in libraries? Was it in books? Was it in other storage devices? So that you have to hire a consultant. And then you have to find the right piece. And again, there's a technology to searching. For instance, alphabetization, the search engines of the time, and interpreting it correctly. And maybe most important, and certainly most important today, separating fact from fiction. So why do these access costs matter? Well, I have a little diagram here, but I'm not going to get into it too long because it would take too much time. But basically, if you look at those 2 kinds of knowledge that I've described, each of those 4 squares tells you what they can, why they need access to either other knowledge of that kind or to knowledge of the other kind. Okay, so for instance, if you look at the bottom right square here, why does, if you want to create new prescriptive knowledge, do you want to know what prescriptive knowledge is around? Well, you want to make sure you don't invent the wheel, right? So if you spend time and resources on inventing something, you want to make sure nobody else invented this before me. But also, you need to know what's around, because many inventions consist of the hybridization and recombination of existing knowledge. So there's that. But perhaps most important, and this is something I do want to dwell on a little bit, is transactions cost in the market depend on trust. Let's say somebody comes to you with an idea, as I said earlier on, and he tries to convince you of that idea. Can you trust that person? And I think that issue is the main theme of a very famous book in the history of science, which is Schaefer and Chapin's classic book on Leviathan and the air pump. And essentially, it's about whom can you believe. And so Baconians, like Boyle, for instance, basically were describing their experiments and selling it to the public, and others like Hobbes said that this could not be believed, and so can you trust witnesses. What you need to create is what's known as a technology of trust. And that's still true today. If somebody tells you that smoking is bad for you. Not a terribly controversial thing, but nobody who believes that proposition has actually tested it in a way. Other people have tested, and they tell you, I've tested it, and this is the result. And if you smoke, your probability of getting lung cancer is blah, 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 blah. You trust these people. But that trust is a social construct. It's depending on the parameters of that society. But what it really says is that people who do not perform an experiment could still accept its result. And that is what they call collectively certified. And that trust, as I said, is basically a convention. And sometimes these conventions are challenged and undermined by other experts, and that will raise access costs. So we have today in the United States, just to give you an example, a group of people who basically challenge the notion that certain vaccines prevent certain diseases. And, they challenged the convention. That, in and of itself, is expensive, because some people will believe it and get sick, and the people who defend the convention have to spend resources defending it. And so, of course, what happened in the period that I'm talking about is a sharp decline. Okay, this is a typo. It should be increased access, not access cost. I apologize. But markets work smoother. And, of course, the printing press is one example. The other is the growing effectiveness of the postal system, in which people corresponded with one another. But maybe the biggest reduction in access cost is what I call the codification project. And so part of what I call the Industrial Enlightenment is about codifying technical knowledge that had been hard to access before. Most of it is artisanal knowledge. And artisanal knowledge is what's known as tacit knowledge. Okay, that's Michael Polanyi's famous term. And most of these skilled artisans, kept it secret. But even if they didn't, they couldn't describe what they did. Basically, this is how you bake bread. This is how you work iron. This is how you brew beer, I know how to do it because I learned it from my master. But describing it in more detail, they couldn't. And so what codification does, it reduces access costs for people who want to find out by writing it down. And so books mattered. But above all, of course, these are books that organize knowledge in a way that is accessible. This was described wonderfully by a superb book by Daniel Hedrick, published in the year 2000. So here's one example. This is the Dictionary of Arts and Sciences, put together by a guy, a reverend actually, called Henry Croker. It was published in 1764. And this is what it covers. I mean, this is like 3 huge volumes, okay? But look what it's covered. It covers all kinds of things, but it covers anatomy, and it covers pharmacy, and it covers surgery, and it covers hydraulics, and it covers mechanics, and it covers pneumatics, and so on and so forth, okay? And so I actually looked at it. I mean, this is advanced stuff, ladies and gentlemen. The chapter of hydraulics includes a fair amount of fairly advanced calculus, and the ones on chemicals, a fair amount of advanced chemistry, which turned out to be wrong, but here is, of course, the most famous of all these codifications. This is, of course, the Grande Encyclopédie, which, among others, has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of technical essays about how to make anything. Less well known than D'Alembert and Diderot's Encyclopédie, which is probably the paradigmatic Enlightenment document, is this thing. This is the Description des Arts et Métiers. It's a very much an Ancien Régime kind of document, but it is a series of books, I think there were 82 altogether, that describe every kind of artisanal knowledge that you can imagine in the minutest detail. So here is one example that I picked more or less at random, that you get the idea what it looks like, okay? This is a locksmith. And you can sort of see, I mean, this goes with a huge amount of text, precisely how to put a lock together. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you know nothing about locksmithing that you could read this chapter and be a locksmith. Okay, nobody argues that. But if you are a locksmith who was reasonably good and you wanted to see what at least the cutting edge was at the time, you could do worse than go to the description. And that, I think, is what I mean by the codification part. These things are starting to come out. This, by the way, I think the last volume was published in 1787, I believe, and of course, after that, till Gellius, so this was discontinued. But there are other things that keep coming up. For some reason, much of it is written by the French, and somebody once said that the Industrial Revolution was carried out by the English while the French were writing about it. There's some truth to that. Not, it's an overstatement, but it's not so bad. So here are, for instance, this is a book about, about coal mining, written by an obviously very much a Frenchman, Monsieur Morin. This is in 1770. But he got most of his wisdom by visiting coal mines in Britain. And then wrote this book about it that explains precisely, how we get it. This is about machine. This is all written by a Frenchman called, in French, I'm sorry, it's actually Spanish, I think, Betancourt. And this is an elementary course in machinery. So this is the beginning of sort of formalized mechanics as supported by people, particularly in the French Polytechnique. So, I don't know how much time I have. I want to speak briefly about the market for ideas in China and then jump and say a few things about our own age. Okay, so let me say a few things about China, simply because so far I have been shamefully Eurocentric, and of course that's unacceptable. So, China is different from Europe. I mean, that's an uncontroversial statement. But it was not, ladies and gentlemen, backward in an intellectual sense. It had a large private publishing sector. People published commentaries, encyclopedias were written, technical manuals, mathematical treatises, many of them, I would say, before or in the early days of the Ming Dynasty, but still. And Beijing is this famous book market, which took place at the site of a glazing glass factory, which is called the Liu Lichang, which means glass and glazing glass factory. Okay? And people have visited those and they describe it. And so you could buy books there. People came from all over China to buy books. And most of these were classics, antiquarian items, and materials to prepare for the examinations. But there was also a great technical encyclopedia. This is the great Nongshu, published in 1313, which might have been available there. Also, nobody's actually proven that. But clearly, China produced some superstars in science. Of those, maybe the most famous one were these three, Shen Kuo, Su Song, and Guo Shouqing, who were the first two were during the Song Dynasty, and Guo was during the Yuan, which is the Mongol Dynasty, and it still had some formidable intellectuals. And in some ways, you might say, well, these were superstars. But there's one huge difference, and that is every single one of them that I could trace down was actually a government official. Whereas in Europe, none of these scientists were government officials. They may have been patrons, or enjoying patronage, I should say, but they were not officials. In China, there is this concept of superstar, but it was organized in a very different way than it was in Europe. It is competitive, but the way the competition works is only in one mechanism, and that is the imperial examination. And within that imperial examination, it's essentially constrained by the material that people study for the... and so, as I said, that's what I said, I mean, they were beholden to the emperor, and they were serving at his pleasure. Whereas in Europe, that was distinctly not the case. And so the incentive structure is very different from it works in Europe. If you wanted to be respected and wealthy in China, you had to do well on the examination. Eventually, the highest rank, which is Jinshi, is that opens, the gates of prosperity and fame for you. But it is not by coming up with a new idea or writing principia. It is about doing well on the examination, regurgitating and parroting the same material that people had been repeating hundreds and hundreds of years. Radical dissenters, insofar that there were a few, I dug them out, they were frowned upon and often suffered harsh ideas. So there is a market for ideas, but it is constrained and it is monopolized. And so in that regard, I think, unlike European nonconformist writers, Chinese writers never had the option to flee to another regime. There is no world outside China if you lived in China. Whereas if you lived in Saxony, you could go to Bavaria. If you lived in Bavaria, you could go to Kleef, or you could go to the Netherlands, you could go to England. You people moved around, and they did. Okay, so that, I think, is a huge difference. But above all, it's the Keiju system, the imperial examination system. And most recent work, particularly that of Yasheng Huang, who's a political scientist at MIT, basically has taken a dim view of this system. And I think it's not so much that there was no talent in China. There was just as much talent as there is in Europe. But it was misallocated because the incentives were wrong. That's what an economist, I think, will find most convincing. And the system really remained unchanged until the imperial examinations were abolished 7 years before the Chinese Revolution. And yet it did produce a large class of upper tail human capital. And so learning was admired and revered. But it is not the kind of learning that will put food on your table and shoes on your feet. That's where they differ from Europe. Now, of course, they still love learning and they still go to universities, but now the Chinese effort has been redirected toward more useful knowledge, and we're all living with the consequences, but that's a different story. And in that sense, and this is a bit of a stretch, but I'm going to try it anyway, what the heck. In that regard, the Chinese are much like the Jews, because the Jews in Europe, much like the Chinese, were educated, literate, committed to books, and as the classic book on this is Botticini and Eckstein, The Chosen Few, which is published in my series. And yet these Jews, even so they had far more human capital per person than the non-Jews, contributed absolutely nothing to the advance of science and technology between 1500 and 1750. I looked. It's not there. After 1750, the story changes dramatically. Until then, they do nothing. But what happens in 1750, much like what's happened in China after the revolution, is all this potential for learning, for intellectual activity is redirected towards things that are more useful. And the results, of course, are of deep historical importance. So what about today? And so, as I said, the market for ideas today is, essentially a scaled-up version of the market for ideas that emerged in the 16th and 17th century. One of the things that I can't avoid mentioning, because very few people seem to know this, is that one of the great innovations of our time is the scientific paper. So until that happened, basically publications either took the form of books or short communications in periodicals. But the scientific paper is actually a fairly recent invention. And it was first, I think, published in something called Die Annalen der Physik und Chemie, which was founded in 1799, but the editor was a man called Poggendorf, who for 50 years was the editor. And in that journal, it is the scientific paper make its first appearance. And still in 1900, and that's fairly late, some of the most respected journals did not contain a single scientific paper that we would recognize today as a paper. Okay, the difference is one of length. If it was too short, it would be a short communication. If it was longer, you write a book. That's how it was. Now, something about incentives. The patent system is as powerful and as strong as it ever was. I hasten to add, and I hope I don't sound Eurocentric here, the patent system is very much a European idea. There is nothing like it in Islamic civilization, there's nothing like it in China until the Westerners show up. And then for the first time, the Chinese are exposed to a patent system. It takes them, another 2 or 3 generations until they finally catch on. But now, if you look at these numbers, in 2024, the US filed about 600,000 patents, the EU about 200,000, China 3.7 million. So it looks like they finally figured out that this system actually works. Now, what about propositional knowledge? And again, the seeds were planted around 1500. But what is happening today is, of course, a huge explosion of incentives, okay? There are endless prizes, medals, book prizes, you know. The best book written in French rural history in the 14th century, okay? Big applause, you know. Somebody gets a check for $50 and he puts it on his or her curriculum vitae, and the dean says, a prize-winning article, okay? Now, some of these, of course, extremely desirable and well-known. You know, you think about the Lasker Prize, the Fields Medal in mathematics, the Balzan Prizes, the Wolf Prize, the Spanish BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Prize, the Dutch Spinoza Prizes, Kavli Prizes, to name a few. Now, almost all of those prizes are recent invention. Even the Nobel Prizes only started in 1901. And these prizes, some of these involve cash, and some of them involve just a medal, but they are enormously desirable. And as I showed earlier with my Ray Damadian story, it is the medal and the reputation that people want, not necessarily the money. Also, you know, I'll take the check, you know. So in Britain, here's an interesting example. They had the idea of knighting or ennobling people for their past contribution to science. That idea is not completely new. Isaac Newton was ennobled. So was Humphrey Davy, whom I mentioned earlier, and Lord Kelvin. But it happened fairly few, and even Michael Faraday actually declined it, which is typical maybe of him, but never mind. But in the 20th century, this became more common. So some of the great British scientists, J.J. Thomson, Ernest Rutherford, Arthur Eddington, were all knighted. And some of them were knighted after the Nobel Prize. But after 1980, this becomes much more common. And I'm very pleased to say it was even extended to economists. So I have a very good friend who is Sir Tim Besley, one of the great economists of Britain, but he is now Sir Tim. So there. And of course, the Dutchman Andre Geim, which you remember the famous scandal with his citizenship. I'm not going to get into that. But basically, ennobling people. I mean, there's no money involved. You don't get it. And many of these things involve no money. Like I'm a member of something quite desirable called the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. They don't pay me. I pay membership, $400 a year, you know. I play it willingly because it is kind of a signal. What shall I say? Asian nations have come up with it. Japan set up its Japan Prize. China established the State Preeminent Science and Technology Award. And some of them are private, some of them are set by government. We have in the United States the National Medal of Science that was awarded by the President of the United States, started in 1959 by Eisenhower, but it remains at the discretion of the President, so maybe you will not be shocked to say that none were awarded between 2016 and 2022, and probably none will be awarded this year, so it's too early to tell. There's the National Medal for Science and Innovation, established by Jimmy Carter, and on and on and on. And so there are these sort of winner-take-all prizes. And to repeat what I said earlier, but in a much larger scale, okay, the hope of winning one of those prizes, one of those distinctions, is what's driving people. Even so, presumably, the vast majority of them will, in some sense, be disappointed. And people still practice open science, one of the innovations of the market for ideas in the 16th century. And here I can't resist of mentioning the work of a man whom I greatly admire called Derek Price, who was a historian of science at Yale, and we overlapped, but I never met him at the time. And Price had sort of an interesting point to make, which I'd like to sort of throw out here on the market for ideas. So he actually predicted, he wrote a little book called Little Science, Big Science, which is still available. It's a kind of a classic. And he suggested that it would lead, that eventually the number of papers would start declining. And the argument is simply sort of almost Malthusian. So saying the number of papers has been increasing much faster than the population. So in the end, we'll just bury the world in scientific papers if we extrapolate that. And that seemed unlikely. So people basically at the time accepted the slowdown in scientific progress. So here you got Derek. That's his one of his. The thing on his left is the Antikythera mechanism, which he helped decipher, and that's the book Little Science, Big Science. But he's turned out to be premature. In 2023, about 3.3 million scientific papers were published worldwide. Where exactly they draw the line, I'm not 100% sure. But compared consistently with those in 2014, there's a 50% increase in the last decade. So other estimates were slightly less, but 3 million is probably the sort of reasonably thing. Now, eventually, Price will be right? The number of papers will decline. But so far, the market for ideas seems to be well supplied. And so the supply side is thriving. There are no signs to date. And of course, where I think Price was wrong, and he couldn't have known this, is he didn't think about China. And not about the incredible number of papers that are coming out of China now, and that even quality weighted seem to be slowly overtaking and passing by the West. And so access cost has little to be said. We're not dependent on slow and costly postal service, although postal services are still slow and costly, but nobody uses them. And talking about the clumsy printing presses where people would sort of stand there and use these, I mean, all of that is, of course, completely gone. And so, here's the last question. Access costs, at least at first superficial glance, seem to be going to zero. With the internet, with Google, with search engines, AI, you know, some of you use ChatGPT, some of you use Claude, but basically you want to know something, you push 2 buttons, you have the answer. Not all access costs, however, will disappear. Storage and search costs are today negligible. But there are other costs that I didn't quite emphasize enough, but become more important in our own age. Okay? One of them is verification, and the other is selection. You need to separate the wheat from the chaff. You need to tell real information from misinformation and recognize when the information machinery is deliberately misleading or just randomly hallucinating. But more dangerous, I think, is this. Artificial intelligence and other ideas technology can create fake news and misinformation that looks like the real thing. And what that will do is to undermine the technology of trust that Safer and Chapin were talking about, and our willingness to put our faith in experts. Now, that's partly a political event, of course, because this distrust of experts is part of the attack of populist regimes on people who consider themselves in the elite, where presumably experts belong. That is going to raise transactions cost in the market for ideas, it's going to raise access cost, and it may slow things down. So if supply is thriving, so is demand. And the demand for new knowledge is going to come, I predict, not only from our continuous desire to experience economic growth, which, you know, hasn't been all that great in Europe the last 25 years. In the US, maybe has been a little bit better. But basically, I don't think economic growth, as commonly defined, is the main reason why we want innovation. We need innovation because the human race is faces to the greatest challenges since the beginning of humanity: climate change and associated phenomena, and demography, which is the decline in fertility. And these will be a source of endless demand for new ideas. And I'm convinced that the market for ideas will supply that. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is another story. Now, before I finish, here is one quote that came out after I'd written this lecture. And this is an article written by Xu Weifang, who's a professor at Harvard, who actually gave an answer that I hadn't thought about. And so I'd be glad to share it for you if you haven't read the Economist issue of April 16. She says, AI doesn't just create machine demand, it simultaneously expands human demand as well. The obscure corners of information demand, very specific needs that no article or broadcast could ever serve before, become addressable. Conversational AI brings latent demand to the surface and helps people articulate needs they could not previously express. And so it itself will increase the demand for knowledge, because you're going to ask questions that you would have never asked before you had ChatGPT or Claude or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, geweldig. Ga ze. Thank you, Joel, for this very, very inspiring talk. It took a little bit longer than we thought, but you know, what can you say to a superstar when the audience is so engaged all the time? I didn't want to take it away for a minute from the audience. So thank you very much for this really inspirational talk. Our second discussant this afternoon is Jutta Bolt. She's a professor of global economic history at the University of Groningen, where she also received her PhD in 2010. Her work focuses on long-term and global patterns by comparative economic development and compare all of those across the globe and over time, with a special focus on Africa. Jutta is particularly known for her work on measuring and understanding inequality over this very long run. She also has received many grants and prizes for her academic work, and in particular, so I found out when studying your CV, Jutta, you obtained many of these grants and prizes from institutions in Sweden. So that may be an indication of something even more beautiful. Your presence today as a very influential economic historian is very valuable, because I think you will also connect Mokyr's work about the market for ideas to contemporary questions of openness and inequality and inclusion.
All right, hello everyone. I am very well aware I'm standing between you and some form of discussion, but trust me, it's going to take 7 minutes and 40 seconds, and then we're done. I'm very glad to be here. So in 2006, Joel Mokyr received the Heineken Prize for History, awarded by the Koninklijke Nederlandse Academie van Wetenschappen, for his research into the origins of modern industrial economies. At the same time, in that same year in Groningen, when I was still a very young PhD student, he delivered his accompanying Heineken lecture. And I imagine that this prize must have meant a great deal to him. not only because of its prestige, but because it represented something that his own work and today's lecture, I think, has repeatedly emphasized: international scholarly recognition. The production of new ideas is not driven only by money and by material rewards, but also by prestige, reputation, and recognition within a wider scholarly community. In a market for ideas, where knowledge is difficult to own and monetize directly, reputation becomes a crucial incentive for innovation itself. And I think in many ways, Joel Mokyr's own career reflects this dynamic. The Heineken Prize, and the Nobel Prize for that matter, was not only a personal honor, but also part of this broader system of recognition that encourages intellectual creativity, scientific ambition, and the production of new ideas. Now, the core message of the 2006 lecture was that modern economic growth cannot be understood only through capital accumulation or technology in a narrow sense. The argument was that the European Enlightenment fundamentally changed how societies thought about knowledge, progress, innovation, and in doing so created the intellectual conditions that later enabled the Industrial Revolution and sustained economic growth. And comparing the 2006 lecture with today's lecture shows how remarkably stable Joel Mokyr's core thinking has remained over these 2 decades. In both lectures, I think the central claim is essentially the same. Economic progress ultimately depends on the way that societies organize, reward, exchange, and evaluate ideas. And I think one concrete idea I find especially insightful from Joel Mokyr's work is really this distinction between propositional knowledge and prescriptive knowledge. Propositional knowledge means understanding, the what of the world or why things work, where prescriptive knowledge means knowing how to apply that understanding in practice, so how things work. And according to Joel, economic growth emerges where thinkers and doers find each other, when scientists, engineers, craftsmen, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers increasingly interact. And I think that insight remains highly relevant today. In the Dutch context, it is a reminder that innovation depends not only on universities and academic excellence, but equally on strong vocational and technical training. A knowledge economy does not function without people who know how to translate ideas into production, engineering, maintenance, and implementation. And I think our current shortages in technical and applied professionals make this very visible. And it really questions how we organize our educational system and how we reward both our thinkers and our doers. At the same time, I think, Mokyr, your framework really raises difficult questions. So we've learned today that historically, Europe became successful because it combined political fragmentation with intellectual integration. Ideas circulated across borders through networks of scholars, publishers, universities, scientific communities. And competition between states prevented complete intellectual monopoly, while transnational exchange allowed useful knowledge to spread. Ironically, what once made Europe innovative may today risk becoming a weakness. Europe still possesses world-class universities, I would argue, and researchers, but knowledge infrastructures often remain fragmented. Universities, firms, governments, and innovators do not always interact effectively enough, and productivity growth as a result might suffer from weaker diffusion of knowledge and weaker economic dynamism. And I think this is especially visible in the concentration of innovation among relatively small group of European dominant firms, while younger firms find it more difficult to struggle to scale up. Joel Mokyr's framework helps explain why this matters, because innovation not only depends on frontier discoveries, but really on this broad diffusion, this interaction, experimentation, and competition between the full market. And I think this raises a broader Dutch question, or a question about the Dutch economy, about incentives and economic dynamism. We've heard today that innovative societies remain open to new entrants, experimentation, talent, But I think parts of the Dutch economy increasingly reward accumulated wealth more than productive risk-taking, education, or entrepreneurship. And that matters because innovation depends not only on ideas, but also on whether talented people actually have the opportunity to develop and apply them. We've heard about this. Europe was relatively egalitarian, meritocratic-based, and according to Marieke Stellinga, she argued this in the NRC last week, drawing on a recent CPB report. Societies become less dynamic and ultimately less innovative when opportunities increasingly depend on inherited wealth and existing economic power. Talented people who are not born into wealth are simply less able to develop their potential and contribute to economic progress. And this is becoming increasingly relevant in the Netherlands, according to Stellinga. Labor is taxed relatively heavily, while accumulated wealth is taxed comparatively lightly. And as a result, passive wealth accumulation and real estate investment can become more attractive than investing in education, entrepreneurship, or professional development. And you really do not need an economics degree to sense that this might weaken the economic dynamism and innovation in the Netherlands. So I think these are ultimately questions about the kind of an open and dynamic society that we need for innovation to flourish. Which brings me back to one of the most striking differences, I think, between the 2006 lecture and today's lecture. The 2006 lecture was, I think, in many ways deeply optimistic. Freer markets for ideas generated innovation. More openness produced growth. Intellectual freedom allowed useful knowledge to accumulate. In 2006, the central problem was repression and lack of openness. And this has shifted. Today, the problem may no longer simply be whether ideas can circulate freely, but whether we can still trust and evaluate them. Historically, Joel Mokyr argued that Europe escaped intellectual stagnation because no single authority could fully suppress innovation. Today, the danger is that open markets for ideas do not necessarily reward the best ideas, but often the fastest or the loudest. And that is precisely what I think, even though that went relatively quickly, your warning at the end is so important. Efficient market for ideas are not automatically good. Information can spread rapidly without necessarily being true, useful, or socially beneficial. And that leaves all of us, I think, with a major challenge. If economic progress ultimately depends on the way societies organize, reward, and exchange and evaluate ideas, how do we organize that market so it results in ideas that remain innovative, trustworthy, and socially beneficial? Thank you.